It was just a little house on the corner of a quiet street, white shutters, a red maple in the yard, and wind chimes that whispered every time the breeze passed through. I'd lived there for over 40 years. Every creak in the floorboards was familiar. The hallway knew my footfall. The kitchen held my history one meal at a time. When my husband passed, it was the house that held me up, not the people. So when my grandson asked if he and his new wife could rent the upstairs suite, I said yes with a kind of trembling hope. Hope that maybe this time family could be close and kind again. Not just in blood, but in warmth, in rhythm, in presence. I had converted the upstairs years ago, a little separate entrance, and all in case one day a caregiver or relative might need to stay. It wasn't luxurious, but it was clean, quiet, and filled with light. I imagined weekend breakfasts, the smell of fresh coffee drifting from both kitchens, and maybe even laughter echoing up the stairwell. I imagined her, his wife, braiding her hair in the mirror, calling down to ask if I needed anything from the store. But when they moved in, things were different. I remember the first morning, I baked blueberry muffins, the kind my grandson used to devour as a boy. I placed them on a little tray and brought them up to welcome them. She answered the door. She didn't take the tray. She just blinked at me like she wasn't expecting me to be so there. "Oh, thanks. We're actually keto," she said with a little laugh. Her voice was polite, her smile practiced, but her eyes never softened. My grandson peeked out behind her, gave me a quick hug, but already he felt distant, like he was navigating some invisible line I hadn't drawn. Still, I told myself it was nerves. They were young, newly married, adjusting. I gave space. I didn't knock, often didn't hover, didn't ask questions, but that space I gave them slowly became a canyon. They came and went at strange hours. I'd hear them laughing on the porch with friends, never once asking if the noise bothered me. I tried to join once, stepped out with my cup of tea and a light cardigan, thinking maybe I could just sit with them for a few minutes. She looked at me, tilted her head, and said, "Do you need something?" Not unkind, but not welcoming either. Just cold, like I was intruding. I backed away slowly, not wanting to embarrass myself. I told myself I was being sensitive, that maybe they'd come around. When I told my neighbor, she smiled and said, "It's good they're there. Company's nice at our age." I nodded but didn't correct her. I wasn't sure if what I had was company. It felt more like cohabiting with strangers who happened to share my name through him. I kept busy, gardened a little reed in the sunroom, listened to the old records I loved. I even began writing again, something I hadn't done since my husband passed. But no matter how much I distracted myself, I felt it, that quiet ache of being tolerated, not loved. One evening, I made a casserole and left it by their door. Just something warm, something homemade. The next morning it was still there, untouched, cold. I took it back downstairs, threw it out, and stood for a moment by the sink, my hands pressed flat on the counter. The silence of that morning was different. It wasn't peaceful. It was hollow. I didn't expect her to be like a daughter, but I never imagined she'd make me feel like a tenant in my own home. That first month I still hoped. I still tried, but already there was something growing in the air, something brittle and sharp. Not quite hostility, but not far from it either. Sometimes I'd hear them laughing upstairs, doors open, music spilling down the staircase. I'd catch the smell of something delicious, roasted garlic, seared meats, and wonder if maybe, just maybe, they'd bring me a plate. But they never did, not once. And I began to notice it, how he spoke to me differently. Shorter sentences, less warmth. His laughter didn't carry the same affection it once did. It was as if he was trying to balance loyalty with someone who didn't want me in their life, and in trying to please her, he was unmaking everything we had ever shared. Still I held my breath. Still I waited. Because that's what we do, isn't it? Women like me. We hope longer than we should. We give more grace than is ever returned. We convince ourselves that love will remember us even when it forgets to knock. But some silences grow too loud to ignore, and mine had only just begun. At first, it was in the little things, the way her voice would rise just slightly, when I was near as if she wanted to be overheard but not spoken to. I'd walk past their parked car and see her through the window pausing mid-sentence when she saw me, then smiling that paper-thin smile that never reached her eyes. I told myself it was my imagination. But that kind of unease, the kind that roots itself in the gut, is usually a warning dressed in silence. I remember the way she decorated the porch. It used to be my little haven. A few potted geraniums, a rocking chair, and a wind chime I'd bought with my husband on our last trip to the coast. But slowly her taste began to overtake mine. Macrame planters replaced my old pots. The wind chime was taken down without a word. "It's too loud," she said once when I asked. "We're going for a more modern vibe." I nodded, but something in me flinched. I wasn't trying to control the space we all lived here, technically, but it began to feel like they were reclaiming it in increments, as if my touches were outdated, embarrassing even. I overheard her once speaking to a friend on the phone in that syrupy tone people use when they want to sound nice while twisting the knife. It's like living downstairs from a grandma sitcom. Everything smells like lavender and casseroles. I sat on the other side of the vent, pretending not to hear. I stared at my hands, remembering how those hands once wiped his tears when he scraped his knee on the gravel driveway. Now they were just symbols of something uncool, something she didn't want around. Their friends came over often, always upstairs, always laughing, never knocking on my door. I'd hear them walking past my window sometimes with wine bottles, sometimes with little dogs yapping at their ankles. Once I opened the front door at the same time one of them was coming in, and she looked at me as if I were the housekeeper. "Oh, sorry, I didn't realize anyone else lived here," she said. I just nodded. What could I say? The worst part wasn't even the exclusion. It was the performance of politeness. She always said thank you when it was required, always smiled just enough to keep things from boiling over. It was the kind of hospitality you offer to someone you're stuck with, in an elevator, not family, not warmth. I became a background fixture, an echo in my own home. My grandson, bless him, tried in small ways. He would bring the mail to my door or ask if I needed anything from the store. But even those gestures felt rehearsed, like he was following a script. I once asked if they'd like to have dinner with me, just the three of us. He hesitated. "Let me check with her," he said, and my heart tightened, not because he asked, but because he didn't come back with an answer until 3 days later, and the answer was no. "She's got work stuff," he said. "Maybe next time." But there never was a next time. One night I heard them laughing, really laughing, and I tiptoed to the base of the stairs. It was late, and something about their voices made me ache. That kind of full-bodied laughter you get when you're young and light and free of consequence. I wanted to be happy for him. I wanted to believe he was building a joyful life. But it was the laughter of people who had closed a door behind them, and I was on the other side. A friend from my church came by one afternoon. We sat in the kitchen with tea and lemon cookies. She glanced toward the ceiling once and asked, "Are they nice?" I paused too long. "They're young," I said. She nodded. Sometimes young people forget that age doesn't mean irrelevance, and something in me cracked a little at that. They forgot. Or maybe they never bothered to know. I wasn't looking to be adored or obeyed. I just wanted to be acknowledged, to be considered. Even a simple knock on the door, a shared laugh, a cup of tea. But instead, I was the awkward presence in their carefully curated lifestyle, the woman who smelled like lavender and casseroles. Once I bought a new throw blanket for the shared hallway bench, something soft with little embroidered flowers. She took it off the next day, replaced it with a neutral minimalist one. Just keeping things consistent, she said, as if kindness were a design flaw. The exclusion wasn't sudden. It was a series of small, sharp slights. Not enough to call out without seeming dramatic, but enough to feel like paper cuts all over the soul. And still I stayed silent, because I didn't want to be that woman, the nagging elder, the bitter relic. I thought maybe if I kept being kind, they'd eventually see me, really see me. But the truth I started to feel like a chill crawling into the edges of the house was that I had never been invited into their story. I was a guest overstaying a welcome they never extended. And every quiet, careful thing they did was a reminder that I didn't belong in the family I had once thought I was building. I started to dread the sound of footsteps on the stairs, not because they were loud, but because they reminded me of how light and free they sounded, so unlike my own. Their lives moved with speed and ease while mine had begun to slow, and in the slowing I had hoped to be seen. But instead I was being carefully, methodically erased from the story of the very home I had built, with love and decades of sacrifice. I'd sit on the edge of my bed in the early morning listening to their movements above me. The clink of mugs, the faint thrum of their music, always too loud, but not quite enough to justify asking them to turn it down. Even my complaints had begun to feel out of place, like the mutterings of a museum piece no one paid attention to. One afternoon, I walked into the kitchen to find two strangers sitting at the table, a couple of her friends stylish and aloof, sipping iced coffee in glasses from my cabinet. She had given them a tour, apparently, of my home. I smiled and offered a polite greeting, and one of them looked me up and down and said, "Oh, you must be the landlady." The landlady, not grandmother, not even homeowner, just the woman who lived downstairs, apparently employed by their lifestyle. Later that week, I found a scented candle burning in the hallway, a floral scent that made my nose itch and my eyes water. I blew it out and gently moved it aside, leaving a note that said, "Please no open flames in the hallway, thanks." The next day the candle was back. No note, no explanation. I felt like I was whispering into a void. But what broke me most wasn't the strangers, or the smells, or the new throw pillows that appeared in the shared spaces. It was how my grandson stopped calling me Gran. He began referring to me by my first name when she was around. Once I asked why, and he smiled awkwardly and said, "She just thinks it's weird to use family terms when we're all kind of, roommates." Roommates. That word made my breath hitch. I hadn't been his roommate when I stayed up all night during his fevers. I hadn't been his roommate when I taught him how to ride a bike, when I sewed his Halloween costumes, or when I held his trembling hand the day his father, my son, walked away from us. Roommates. They had dinner parties upstairs. I could hear the laughter, the clinking of wine glasses, the rising chorus of stories told by people in their prime. Never once was I invited, not even as an afterthought. I'd see the plates piled high in the trash later, imported cheeses, smoked meats, the kinds of foods I only ever saw in magazines. And yet my kitchen remained dark and still, with my modest pot of lentils simmering quietly on the stove. Once I baked a pie apple cinnamon crust, still warm from the oven. I thought I'd offer it up as a kind gesture, a way to bridge whatever divide had silently settled between us. I knocked gently on their door. She answered, earbuds in, and when I held out the pie, she blinked. "Oh, thanks, but we're not really doing sugar right now." She didn't even reach for it. I stood there, arms heavy, pie cooling between us, and nodded. "All right then." I walked back down the stairs and cried quietly into a paper towel in my kitchen, not because of the pie, but because of how far I'd fallen in their eyes. And still I tried. I offered to split the utility bills more fairly when I saw their usage was higher. She said, "Oh, no, it's fine. We're happy with how it's set up." Happy. She was happy, while I was shrinking in my own house. Then came the moment that made it all unmistakably clear. I was walking back from the garden with a basket of herbs when I overheard them talking on the porch. She was laughing loud and without restraint and said to one of her friends, "She's always just around, you know, like a ghost who makes soup." A ghost who makes soup. I felt my knees go soft. I stepped quietly back inside Herb's forgotten on the counter. I stared at the wall for a long time, long enough for the sun to move from one side of the window to the other. I didn't say anything that night. I didn't call them out. I didn't demand respect. Instead, I let the truth wash over me. I wasn't uninvited. I had never truly been welcome. Not in their upstairs world. Not in their new life. They tolerated me because I came with the property. I was the cost of a cheap rental. I was a quaint side character in their story, easily edited out. And once I knew that really knew it, something inside me stopped hoping. Not out of bitterness, but out of self-respect. I began to see everything differently after that. The quiet wasn't peaceful anymore. It was heavy. The kitchen didn't feel like a place of warmth. The garden didn't smell sweet. The house, my home, had become a shadow version of itself. I had become a tenant in my own life. And yet even then, I didn't act. Not yet. I needed to feel it fully. Let the pain sink in, not just the betrayal, but the slow fading of identity of mattering. Because when a woman realizes she has become invisible, the world doesn't change right away. But something inside her does. And that shift, that quiet shift, is where everything begins. My birthday had always been quiet but cherished. I never expected grand gestures, just a warm meal, maybe a few shared stories, the familiar hum of voices I loved filling the air. The year before, my grandson had surprised me with a bouquet of daisies and a card that read, "Thanks for raising me right." I had tucked it in my drawer and read it every so often when the house felt too quiet. But this year was different. It was the first birthday since they'd moved in. I told myself not to expect too much. They were busy young, finding their rhythm. I would keep things simple. I baked a small cake lemon with buttercream and set the table with a few old lace napkins I'd been saving. I even lit a candle. One candle. Not for age, just for softness. The day began with silence. No knock, no card, no footsteps on the stairs. I waited until noon before giving up on the hope of a shared breakfast. I thought perhaps they were planning something for the evening, maybe a surprise. I held on to that thought like a thread in a storm. It wasn't until dusk that I heard movement above me more than just footsteps. Music, laughter, doors opening and closing. I stood by the bottom of the staircase listening, waiting for some sign that I was included. The music was upbeat, too loud for conversation, the kind they played when they had friends over. I strained my ears for a voice, a mention of my name, a pause in their movements. Nothing came. I climbed the stairs slowly, cake in hand, pretending I was just checking on the porch light. The door was ajar, and through the sliver I could see fairy lights strung across the ceiling, bottles of wine on the counter, and a group of their friends gathered around the table. A charcuterie board spread wide glasses, raised mid-toast. She stood at the center, laughing loudly, her arm looped through my grandson's. I didn't hear the whole sentence, just a phrase caught in the noise. And thank God we're not stuck doing some awkward birthday dinner downstairs. The room burst into laughter. My grandson didn't speak. He didn't defend me. He didn't even glance toward the door. I backed away before anyone noticed me. My arms trembled, not from the weight of the cake, but from the weight of everything that moment confirmed. I returned to my kitchen, untouched cake in hand, and sat at the table in the fading light. I didn't light the candle again. I let the silence settle over me, heavy as snow. Later that night, I could hear the party continue, glasses clinking, music thumping through the floorboards. I washed the dishes slowly, hands submerged in warm water, letting the hum of the faucet drown out the ache in my chest. Every memory of birthdays, past the ones where he'd sit on my lap giggling with frosting on his face, came rushing back like ghosts, and I couldn't stop them. I didn't cry, not yet. My tears had learned patience over the years, but there was a tightness behind my eyes that refused to leave, as if even they had grown tired of being ignored. The next morning he came downstairs, not with a card, not with a slice of cake, not even with a happy birthday. He asked if I had an extra trash bag. I handed him one without a word. Our fingers brushed, and he flinched like I was too cold or too much. She never said anything, not that day, not the next. I heard her once through the wall joking on the phone. We survived the in-law birthday minefield. A pause, then laughter. I walked out to the garden that afternoon. The sky was gray clouds heavy with unshed rain. I knelt beside the roses, gloved hands brushing dirt from the roots. The ache in my knees was nothing compared to the ache in my heart. I looked up at the windows above and realized they had drawn the blinds. The house felt split in half light above shadow below. That night I sliced the cake into neat pieces and wrapped each one carefully in wax paper. I placed them in the freezer one by one, as if preserving the last of something I knew I wouldn't make again. Then I opened the drawer, took out last year's card, and read it slowly. "Thanks for raising me right." I smiled bitterly, not because I didn't believe I had, but because I now understood that no amount of love could guarantee someone would stay soft. Not when they'd been given reasons to harden. I put the card away and turned off the lights. The silence of the house wrapped around me like an old coat worn familiar and no longer warm. And still I didn't say a word. I didn't knock on their door. I didn't ask why I had been excluded from my own celebration. Because I already knew the answer. I didn't fit their vibe. I didn't belong in their world of avocado toasts and inside jokes and curated Instagram dinners. I was the relic, the complication, the uncomfortable reminder that family isn't always fashionable. But the quiet thing they didn't know, what neither of them had yet understood, was that a woman like me doesn't vanish. She absorbs. She remembers. And when the time comes, she answers with more than words. It was a Tuesday. I remember because the trash bins were out, and the neighborhood was filled with the clatter of wheels and the low groans of trucks. I was returning from the end of the driveway, moving slower than usual, because of the stiffness in my hip when I saw her on the porch, with a friend, legs curled beneath her. Coffee in hand, sunglasses perched like armor. They didn't notice me at first. They were too absorbed in their conversation, voices rising and falling like waves, punctuated by laughter that never reached their eye. And then I heard it. As casually as someone might mention the weather, she said, "She's nice enough, I guess, but she just doesn't fit our vibe, you know." Her friend laughed, nodded, and mumbled something I couldn't make out. And then they both turned their heads and saw me standing by the hedge, frozen in place. For a heartbeat, everything stopped. Her smile faltered, then flicked back on like a switch. "Oh, morning," she called out, syrupy and bright, as if the words she'd just spoken hadn't landed like a stone in my chest. I nodded. That's all I could manage. I turned back toward the house, walking slowly, like my legs had forgotten how to carry this new weight. She doesn't fit our vibe. It echoed over and over like a bell tolling in a place meant for silence. What did that even mean? What vibe did they think they owned? I had lived here for decades. This home held every piece of me, every heartbreak, every triumph, every long afternoon spent building a life with hands that cooked, scrubbed, comforted, and carried. And now I was a poor fit for the atmosphere, like an off-color pillow in a living room they were redecorating. That night I sat in the living room with the lights dimmed. I didn't want to see myself in the window's reflection. I just sat there and thought about all the ways I'd been trying to mold myself into something palatable for them. Quieter, smaller, less visible. I'd second-guessed every casserole, every knock, every small kindness, as if kindness were something that needed permission. She didn't want me there, not truly. And now she'd said it out loud, not directly to me, of course. That would require a level of honesty and courage she didn't possess. No, she preferred to float her insults on laughter aimed sideways but sharp as glass. I kept thinking of the word vibe, so young, so vague, a word people use to dismiss something without explanation, to end a conversation without confrontation. I wasn't her style. I didn't match the aesthetic. I made things feel too real, too grounded, too old. The next morning, my grandson came down to borrow a step stool. I handed it to him in silence, and as he turned to go, I asked gently, "Do I make her uncomfortable?" He looked startled, maybe even a little guilty. No, he said too quickly. She has her own way. She's not great with older people or family stuff. Don't take it personally. Don't take it personally. That's what people say when they want you to accept mistreatment without making them feel guilty, as if it's a favor to keep swallowing the slights. I didn't say another word. I just watched him carry the stool up the stairs 2 at a time, like he was escaping something heavy. Days passed, and the shift between us settled into something permanent. She stopped saying hello altogether. I stopped leaving muffins at their door. We became a ghost town with 2 floors, each person pretending the other didn't exist. The air felt thick, like walking through fog made of everything unspoken. Once I found a shared grocery list posted on the fridge. She had crossed off butter and scribbled plant-based spread next to it. I hadn't asked for her opinion, but there it was. Even my fridge was being curated. I didn't want a war. I didn't want loud words or slammed doors. I just wanted space, respect, basic human regard. But she couldn't offer that, not even in small doses. And so I pulled back further. I stopped checking in. I stopped smiling when I passed her in the driveway. I even stopped tending to the flowers on the side of the house that faced their entrance. Let them see what the world looked like when I withdrew my care. She never noticed, but I noticed myself becoming less of who I had been, retreating into smaller routines, speaking only when necessary, nodding instead of greeting. I had become in her eyes exactly what she wanted invisible. And yet inside me something began to simmer, not rage, not spite, just a slow, steady awareness that I was allowing them to turn my home into a place where I no longer belonged. The tipping point wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It came while I was watering the garden, watching a slug slowly devour one of my marigolds. And I thought that's what they're doing, quietly, methodically, turning my joy into mulch. That's when I decided I wouldn't shrink anymore. I didn't need her approval. I didn't need her friendship. I didn't even need her to like me. But I did need to live in a space that honored me, not belittled me. I didn't know exactly what I was going to do yet, but I knew this the next time I was told I didn't fit the vibe it would be, because the vibration had shifted, and I was the one who moved it. The house had never felt like this before. It used to breathe with me. It used to know my rhythm when I rose, when I cooked, when I prayed quietly at the window. It was the kind of place that creaked in familiar ways like an old friend, clearing its throat gently, reminding me that I was not alone. But after they moved in, something changed. The house became split, not just physically upstairs and downstairs, but emotionally, spiritually. The walls no longer echoed my life. They absorbed a new language, one I didn't speak, one that excluded me entirely. Upstairs became another world, a louder, shinier world, where there was always movement, always light, always noise. I could hear the footsteps, the music, the laughter, the late-night door slams. It didn't just wake me, it unsettled me. Their hours bled into mine, and the peace I once felt while sipping tea in the evening turned into bracing silence, broken by bursts of sound that didn't belong to my life. And downstairs was a waiting room. I was still holding my breath, hoping each day might shift the air. I lit candles to soften the ache, rearranged furniture to distract myself, but nothing settled the unease. Even the photographs on the mantel started to feel like strangers. My husband's face looked out with calm, unknowing eyes. He never lived to see this, and I was grateful for that. One morning I found their dog in my garden, digging tail-wagging soil, flying in all directions. My rosemary bush had been torn from the root. I crouched down slowly, heart pounding from the suddenness, and called to the dog, gently coaxing it away. Minutes later, she came stomping into the yard, phone in hand, sunglasses on, and said flatly, "He's just a dog. Chill. Not an apology, not a glance at the ruined herbs. Just that sharp little word that people use when they want to tell you that your feelings are inconvenient. Chill." I didn't reply. I just nodded and went inside. Later that day, I threw out the ruined rosemary. I didn't bother replanting. What was the point? It would be dug up again, or worse, ignored into rot. Sometimes my grandson would try in his own clumsy way to smooth things over. He once brought me a latte, which he left outside my door with a note that read, "Hope your morning is good." I stood there, staring at it for a long time. Not because it was kind, but because it was so surface deep, it might as well have been written by a stranger. He didn't come inside, didn't ask how I was, just left a drink and vanished. Guilt in paper form. They started hosting more friends. Sometimes it was 3 or 4 people, sometimes a dozen. I never knew until I heard the boots on the stairs, the high heels clicking, the loud voices drifting through the vents. One night I heard her say, "Don't worry, she won't come up. She knows this part's not hers." I stood in the hallway, lights off, hand gripping the door frame like it was the only thing keeping me upright. Not hers. That's how they saw it. The upstairs wasn't mine. The porch wasn't mine. The laughter, the stories, the light, they weren't mine either. They belonged to them, and I was just the shadow underneath. It's strange the things you stop doing when you feel unwelcome in your own home. I stopped playing music, stopped humming while I cooked, stopped hanging laundry outside because I didn't want her friends to see my worn-out nightgowns on the line. I even stopped putting flowers on the kitchen table. What was the point of beauty if no one saw it but me? One evening I caught a glimpse of them through the upstairs window. They were dancing, just the 2 of them, holding hands, smiling, spinning under the string lights she'd hung without asking. I watched from the garden path, my hands still dirty from pulling weeds, and I felt, not anger, not even sadness, just distance, a vast, unbridgeable distance between their world and mine. The next morning I woke up to find their recycling bins overflowing, wine bottles, beer cans, takeout boxes, all piled high like trophies of a life lived loudly. I had asked them once to keep the bins neat. Just once. And her response had been a chirpy, sure thing followed by absolutely no change. This was the pattern. lip service followed by indifference, a kind of passive hostility that wore the mask of youth freedom and casual modernity. But beneath it was something deeper, a fundamental lack of care. And the worst part, my grandson had started to adopt it too. He stopped sitting with me after dinner, stopped asking about my day. Once I called his name as he passed by the living room, and he said, "I'm kind of slammed right now." Rain check, slammed. I had once cradled that child for hours when he was sick. Now he couldn't spare 10 minutes. I began to keep a small notebook, not for vengeance, just for clarity. I listed moments, slights, things said and unsaid. It helped me stay anchored. It helped me remember that I wasn't imagining the slow erasure of my presence, that I wasn't crazy or sensitive or overreacting. I was just awake. Finally, awake. The division in the house had become permanent. I lived below. They lived above. I had memories. They had momentum. I had history. They had style. I had silence. They had sound. And in that growing rift, I began to find the beginnings of a decision. A thought that had been circling quietly, waiting for the right moment to land. Not out of spite, not even out of pain, but from something older, deeper, truer dignity. Because a woman who builds a home does not deserve to be treated like a squatter in it. And soon they would remember that. It's a strange thing to feel yourself disappearing while still alive. No funeral, no eulogy, just a slow dimming like someone turning down the lights, room by room. You walk through your own home and realize no one looks at you anymore, not really. You speak, and your voice lands like wind against glass, felt maybe, but never acknowledged. It began with the way he stopped calling. My grandson had always checked in even before he moved in. A quick need, anything from the store. Gran, or want to come walk the dog with me. But those small gestures stopped. I became someone he passed by on the way to his car, someone he nodded at like a neighbor he barely knew. I used to ask him to sit for tea. I'd pull out the good cups, the delicate ones with the little blue flowers he used to pretend were magic china when he was a boy. But after a few too many, maybe later, I'm heading out, I stopped asking. I started drinking my tea in silence, facing the window, watching the wind move through the trees, while pretending I couldn't hear their laughter upstairs. There's a kind of grief that lives in being ignored. It's not loud, not sharp. It's soft and constant, a low ache that settles behind the ribs and pulses every time someone chooses not to see you. It's the grief of still being here, but no longer mattering. Even holidays changed. Thanksgiving used to mean my table full. Kids' cousins noised the smell of sage and sweet potatoes. This year, they hosted upstairs. I wasn't invited. He came down later with a plate wrapped in foil and said, "We didn't want to overwhelm you. Overwhelm me." As if kindness were a burden. I accepted the plate with a thank you that scraped its way up my throat. I sat alone at my table, same chair as always, eating food someone else had served to someone else first. The turkey was dry. I didn't finish the pie. After that, I stopped opening my blinds. I didn't want to see them leaving for weekend trips, arm in arm, laughing, like I wasn't 20 feet below forgotten. My house became smaller. I stopped walking through the upstairs hall, even though I had every right to. I avoided the shared spaces, the laundry room, the side porch, the back garden. I tiptoed through my own life so they wouldn't have to adjust theirs. One evening, I overheard her talking to someone on speakerphone. "She's sweet," she said, "but kind of always there. You know, like she's watching even when she's not trying to." There was laughter on the other end, then her voice again. "I think she just doesn't get boundaries." I sat frozen in the living room, book in hand, unable to breathe. Boundaries. That's what she called it. as if I had been barging into their world, as if I wasn't already shrinking myself every single day. I began to replay every moment I'd smiled at her, every gentle gesture, every pie, every muffin, every invitation. I had been offering olive branches to someone who saw them as overgrowth. And slowly I stopped reaching. I stopped speaking unless spoken to. I started to move around them like a ghost, quiet, invisible, careful, not to disturb the space they claimed. I knew when they were home by the flicker of light under their door. I knew when they were gone by the blessed stillness that returned to the walls. My grandson no longer looked me in the eye, not in a cruel way, just in the way of someone who had made a choice and didn't want to feel the cost of it. He had picked his piece, and it didn't include me. There were days I felt foolish, like I had misread everything. Maybe I had clung too tightly. Maybe I had hoped for too much. I started to doubt my own memories. Had he ever really looked up to me, or had I imagined it woven a narrative to comfort myself? But then I'd find one of his old drawings tucked in the pages of a book, a stick figure version of us in the garden, my name scribbled across the top in shaky handwriting, me and Gran, and I'd remember that love was real once. I wasn't crazy, I wasn't bitter, I was just left behind. One day I tried to speak up. I asked if they could keep the music lower at night, just gently, just a small request. She smiled and said, "Of course," with that syrupy voice again, and that night it was louder than ever. It wasn't a mistake, it was a message. I stopped asking for anything after that. Even the dog started ignoring me. I'd once offered him treats, played tug-of-war in the yard. Now he walked past me like I was a lamppost. I imagined they'd trained him to avoid me silly, maybe, but that's how it felt. I spent hours reading old journals, old letters from my husband. I needed to remember that I had lived a full life before they made me feel like a footnote in theirs. And in that quiet space, I began to listen to something deeper, a whisper inside that had grown steadier over time. You are not wrong for needing more. You are not wrong for wanting to be seen. I didn't want revenge. I didn't even want reconciliation. I wanted dignity. I wanted space where I didn't have to apologize for existing. And slowly, like a tide turning without fanfare, I realized maybe they had taken over the upstairs. But I still owned the foundation, and it was time I started acting like it. The holidays used to be my time. My kitchen would hum with the smells of cinnamon and cloves, and I'd play those old scratchy carols from the radio songs that reminded me of my mother's hands rolling dough of my husband, lifting ornaments with quiet reverence, of children squealing as they tore open crinkled wrapping paper too early in the morning. The house would fill with heat from the oven and warmth from love. But that year the warmth didn't reach me. It stayed upstairs behind closed doors, muffled by laughter that wasn't meant for me. I had prepared even though no one asked me to. I polished the good silver. I baked a ham glazed with honey and cloves, just like my grandson loved when he was little. I made the layered jello he once begged me to dye green and red. I even put a ribbon in my hair, red velvet soft and hopeful. I waited. The morning passed in silence. No knock. No text. I heard movement upstairs, the creak of floorboards and the occasional hum of a vacuum cleaner. I told myself they were getting ready, that maybe they had a surprise planned, something to make up for the distance of the past months. I kept checking the clock, my heart beat louder with each hour that passed. By noon, I could hear music above me, upbeat, bass-heavy songs that had nothing to do with sleigh bells or choirs. By 1, I heard voices, multiple, laughter too bright, unrestrained, untouched by the thought that anyone might be hurting just below. Still, I waited. I lit the candle in the middle of the table. I poured wine into the tall glass I only used for holidays. I set out 3 plates, one for me, one for him, and one for her, and then I sat. I sat there until the food went cold, until the wax of the candle puddled thick on the runner, until my wine dulled and warmed in my hand. Finally, I stood and walked to the staircase. The door to the upstairs suite was cracked open. I peeked through, not bold, just curious, and saw them all around the table. Friends. A few relatives I didn't recognize. She was holding a wine glass, laughing. He was carving a roast. Someone handed her a wrapped gift, and she tore it open with glee. "You're spoiling me," she said. Someone asked, "What about the downstairs lady? Is she coming up?" And her voice, cool and clipped, answered, "Oh, no. We're keeping it small this year. Just people who match the vibe, you know." They all laughed, like that was funny, like I wasn't real. I backed away, careful not to make a sound. I returned to my kitchen, untouched plates staring at me like questions I couldn't answer. I packed everything slowly. The ham, the jello, the potatoes. I wrapped them in foil, labeled them, placed them in the freezer, as if preserving my hope for another year. I ate a sandwich for dinner. Plain bread, plain meat, no sides. I couldn't taste it anyway. When night came, I turned off all the lights except the one above the mantel. I stared at the Christmas cards from old friends, the ones who still remembered me even if they were too far to visit. And I sat in the hush of a house that had once sung with life, feeling like a widow to something deeper than a death. Later I heard them leaving, the thud of boots, the squeal of tires, the door swinging shut, with laughter still hanging in the air. I stood by the window, watching snow begin to fall, and I realized something painful and simple: they hadn't forgotten me. They had excluded me, on purpose, because I didn't belong in their world. Not because of something I did, but because of who I was. A reminder of where he came from, of a slower, softer life, of roots he'd traded for rooftop cocktails and curated holiday parties. And in that realization, something in me hardened not into anger, but into steel. I didn't cry, not that night. My tears had already dried somewhere in the cracks of all the other days they'd ignored me. What I felt was something colder, something clearer. They weren't going to change. They didn't think they needed to. But I could change. And I would. Because this house was still mine. My name on the deed, my sweat in its walls, my love in its foundation. They could keep their parties, their noise, their polished plates and laughter that never reached me. But they couldn't have my peace. And if I had to reclaim it with paperwork instead of kindness, then so be it. That night, after the silence returned and the snow continued to fall, I didn't go to bed. I sat in my chair beside the front window, wrapped in an old shawl that still smelled faintly of cedar and thyme. I didn't listen to music. I didn't turn on the television. I just listened to the sound of the radiator ticking to the wind, moving softly against the glass, to the quiet voice inside me that I had silenced for too long. There comes a moment, I think, when grief stops feeling like sadness and begins to take shape as clarity. It doesn't come with fanfare. It doesn't come with fists or fire. It comes like a long exhale. And that night, that's what it felt like I'd finally let go of something heavy I didn't even realize I'd been holding. All those months of hoping they'd soften, of giving space, giving kindness, giving the benefit of the doubt. I thought I was being graceful. I thought I was being strong. But there's a fine line between grace and self-erasure, and I had crossed it more times than I could count. I didn't get angry, not in the way I might have when I was younger. My anger now wasn't loud. It was precise, focused. I saw things as they were, not through the blur of love or longing or the stories I'd told myself. I saw that they didn't care if I was happy. They didn't notice when I was hurt, and worst of all, they didn't want to. The woman I used to be, the one who bent backward to keep the family close, who filled every gap with sweetness and every silence with giving. She had been fading for years, but now she was finally gone, and in her place stood someone I hadn't met in a very long time. Me. Not the grandmother, not the nice landlady, not the polite old woman they could quietly ignore. Just me, a woman who had lived, lost, endured, a woman who had built this home with her hands and paid for it with years of work and sacrifice, a woman whose love was deep, yes, but whose silence had become a burden she no longer wanted to carry. I stood from the chair and walked through the house, slowly touching the corners of each room, like I was saying hello again. The wainscoting my husband had installed, the window ledge where my grandson used to press his face against the glass to watch the mail truck, the table I had eaten at alone night after night, still set with care. This was not their home. This was mine. And I had let them treat it like a place they merely rented with charm and entitlement. That's when I opened the drawer by the phone and pulled out the old folder where I kept the deed, the tenant agreement, and all the documents I had never once needed to refer to until now. My hands were steady as I turned each page, not out of vengeance, just necessity. The next morning, I called the lawyer I'd worked with years ago, an old friend, the type who still used a paper calendar, and answered his phone with a cheerful, "Talk to me." I told him I needed to review the rental terms. I didn't elaborate. I didn't need to. He met me the next afternoon. We sat in my kitchen, surrounded by silence, and a single cup of tea growing cold between us. I laid out what I wanted clear, legal, firm. No need for confrontation, no need for drama, just facts, deadlines, and numbers they couldn't argue with. "I want the rent tripled," I said plainly. He looked at me over his glasses, searching my face. "That'll push them out." I nodded once. That's the idea. We didn't discuss morality. We didn't dwell on feelings. He simply adjusted the paperwork and I signed the bottom of the page without trembling. That evening, I didn't hear their music. I didn't hear their laughter. I sat with my tea, breathing slower than I had in months. I wasn't worried about what they'd say. I wasn't worried about how they'd look at me, because for the first time in a long while, I wasn't asking for them to see me. I was seeing myself. And I liked what I saw, a woman still standing, still proud, and no longer waiting for kindness from people who had shown her none. The paperwork would go out in the morning, a simple envelope slid under their door, not a message of anger, just a declaration you cannot live in someone's home while treating them like a stranger. You cannot profit from their peace while dismantling it piece by quiet piece. They had confused my patience for permission, my gentleness for weakness, my silence for surrender. But they were wrong, because this was my house, and I had finally come home to myself. The next morning, the sun came in through the curtains like a quiet agreement, not warm exactly, but steady. I dressed deliberately, not in anything fancy, just something that made me feel like I mattered again. A soft cream blouse, a pair of slacks that still held their shape, and the brooch my husband had given me on our 25th anniversary. It had a tiny sapphire in the center, the color of dusk. I walked downtown instead of driving. It wasn't far, and I needed the rhythm of my feet to help me think. The cold air felt sharper than I remembered, but I welcomed it. It made me feel awake, present. And that morning, for the first time in a long while, I felt like the woman I used to be, the woman who handled things, who didn't flinch when life shifted underneath her. The law office was in a small brick building next to a bakery. The door chimed as I entered, and the scent of lemon polish and old paper wrapped around me like a familiar shawl Gerald, my lawyer, looked up from his desk with a warm smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. He'd helped us write the will years ago after my husband passed. He always had a way of making business feel human. "Morning, Mrs. T," he said. "Haven't seen you in a while." I smiled faintly. That's about to change. He raised an eyebrow but didn't ask questions. He gestured for me to sit, and I laid out the documents, the lease agreement, the old rent receipts, the utility agreements I'd kept in pristine order. I had always done things properly. It was how I was raised. But now I was ready to do something that felt new even to me, reclaim space that was rightfully mine. "I want to increase the rent," I said, "by 3-fold. He blinked. "You sure?" "I'm not asking for your opinion, Gerald," I said gently. "Just your help." He nodded slowly. "Of course. Tripling it. That'll push them out." "That's the point. But I want it clean. No loopholes. I want the new terms in writing. They either pay or they leave." He didn't press. He knew me well enough to understand that this wasn't a rash decision. It was a quiet verdict, after months of a one-sided trial. I had held the evidence in my bones, in the silence of too many cold dinners, in the echo of laughter from upstairs that never invited me in. He drafted the document while I sat in silence, listening to the faint hum of the heater and the scratch of his pen. I watched the words take shape on paper, my declaration not of war but of self-worth. When he slid the final pages across the desk, I read them twice, carefully, every clause, every condition. I made sure it said exactly what I needed it to say. Rent would be raised effective in 30 days. No negotiation. No delay. And if not paid, the tenancy would terminate within the month. I initialed each page, signed at the bottom. I didn't tremble. Not once. Gerald leaned back and studied me with something like admiration. "You know, most people wouldn't have the nerve." "I'm not most people," I said, not with pride, but with quiet truth. He nodded. "Want me to mail it?" "No," I said, standing. "I'll deliver it myself." He smiled. "I figured you'd say that." I walked home slower than I'd walked there. Not because I was tired, but because I was savoring something. The feeling of movement, of direction, of finally stepping into the center of my own life after standing in the wings for far too long. When I reached the house, I paused at the mailbox. Snow was falling gently, the kind that doesn't stick, but softens the edges of everything. I looked up at the upstairs windows, lights on, music faint, just another ordinary day for them. Inside, I sat at the kitchen table with the envelope. I ran my hand over the seal before climbing the stairs, slowly, each step heavier, with memory. How many times had I climbed those stairs, with arms full of baked goods, with love, with hope. Now I carried only a paper. I placed it on their doormat. I didn't knock. I didn't wait. I turned and went back down the stairs with the stillness of a woman who had already said everything she needed to say, not in words, but in action. Back in my kitchen, I made myself tea. Earl Grey, strong, no sugar. I sat by the window and watched the snow dissolve on the glass. And I thought, this is what power looks like at my age. Not raised voices or slammed doors. Not petty revenge or loud proclamations. Just a shift in posture, a steady hand, a refusal to be dismissed. Let them read the paper. Let them laugh. Let them rage. It didn't matter anymore. They had mistaken my quiet for weakness. They were about to learn what strength looked like when it wore pearls and carried 30 years of unpaid grace. I didn't hear anything from them the first day or the next. The envelope had disappeared from their doorstep, but the silence that followed was like a storm gathering above still waters, tense, thick, inevitable. I went about my days as usual. Tea at sunrise, laundry folded with practiced ease. I even took out the good linens again, not for guests, but for myself, because suddenly, everything I touched felt like a small reclaiming. My home was no longer a museum of memories. It was mine again. And that document, those few pages of ink and finality, had said what I had been too exhausted to repeat aloud. I deserve better than this. On the third morning, I heard them moving around earlier than usual. Thumps above me, footsteps crossing the floor, then pausing. I was in the kitchen buttering toast when the knock came. Not sharp, not polite, just hesitant, like someone unsure of how to enter a room they'd already burned. I opened the door to find them both standing there. He held the letter folded once. She stood slightly behind him, arms crossed tight across her chest, wearing that expression I had come to know well, half pity, half superiority. The look of someone who believes they are being wronged simply because you've stopped letting them walk all over you. He cleared his throat. Is this real?" he asked. I met his eyes. I saw the boy I once read bedtime stories to, the one who used to hold my hand crossing the street. But I also saw the man who had chosen comfort over compassion, silence over solidarity. "Yes," I said softly, "it's real." "But triple the rent," she said, sharp now, stepping forward. "That's completely unreasonable. You can't just—" "I can," I interrupted. "And I have." Her mouth hung open for a moment, as if waiting for me to soften, to laugh and say it was all just a joke, to offer tea and forgiveness like I always had before. But I stood still, calm, not angry, just finished. He looked at her, then back at me. "Why are you doing this?" And there it was, the question, the one he hadn't asked in months, even as I disappeared piece by piece from his life. I smiled not out of cruelty, but out of clarity. Because this is my home, and I've been treated like a guest, like a burden, like someone who should shrink to fit the space you want, and I won't do that anymore. He shifted uncomfortably. She scoffed. "This is about your feelings, not the lease. You're punishing us because you're lonely." "No," I said, my voice still even. "I'm lonely because you isolated me. I'm increasing the rent because that's what it costs to stay in this home now. If it's too expensive, you're free to leave." The words hung in the air like snow that hadn't landed yet, beautiful, inevitable, and cold. They didn't argue much after that, not in words. She turned and stormed up the stairs. He lingered a moment longer. "You could have talked to us, Gran." "I tried," I said. "You just stopped listening." He nodded once, eyes lowered, and walked away. I closed the door gently and returned to my toast. It was cold, but I ate it anyway, because now it tasted like peace. The days that followed were quieter. No parties, no music, no loud footsteps on the porch. I heard them moving things, boxes, drag drawers opened and shut. They were packing. They had made their choice, and I had made mine. I didn't gloat. I didn't smile. I just moved through the house like someone returning to a place she once knew, reacquainting herself with the shape of silence when it's not used to hurt you. They didn't say goodbye. I watched them leave from the front window, him carrying boxes, her on the phone barking instructions. They didn't look back. And that was fine. I wasn't expecting a farewell. That letter had been my goodbye, a boundary written in quiet ink, a message they couldn't ignore because it came with consequences. And once the car pulled away, once the door upstairs clicked shut behind them, for the last time, I stood in the middle of the living room and exhaled, not with relief, not even with sadness, just space. I walked slowly up the stairs. The apartment was still, empty. Their scent still lingered, a faint cologne, the sharpness of that candle she always lit, but their presence was gone. I opened the windows wide and let the winter air roll in. Crisp, clean, honest. I sat on the edge of the bed they left behind and ran my hand over the quilt. It was mine. I'd put it there when they moved in, thinking it might make them feel welcome. They never used it. But I would now. Because this space, like the rest of my house, had been returned to me. All I had done was speak. Not with shouting, not with bitterness, but with paper. And in that act, so simple, so quiet, I had reminded them, and more importantly myself, that I still had power, that I still had voice, that I still had value. It was strange, the quiet after they left, like the house was taking a deep breath for the first time in months. The walls felt looser somehow, as if they'd been holding their breath too, waiting for the storm to pass. I walked through the upstairs space once more, barefoot, slow. Their absence didn't echo. It sighed. I hadn't seen their faces much after I delivered the letter, but that final day, the day they left, I caught them one last time. I had stepped out to collect the mail wrapped in my long cardigan hair, pinned back neatly as always, not out of vanity, but because I believe a woman should carry herself with dignity, even when no one's watching. They were loading the last of their boxes into the car. She was barking orders in that clipped, performative voice of hers, the kind she used when she needed to feel like she was in control. He moved slower, quieter, his eyes barely meeting mine as I passed. I nodded politely. That was all. But then she looked up, and her face, oh, her face. It wasn't anger. It wasn't even disbelief. It was something else. A tight little smirk that couldn't decide if it wanted to be condescending or afraid. The look of someone who'd never been told no, realizing for the first time what that word actually meant. She didn't speak. Not then. But I didn't need her to. Her silence was a confession. They thought they were the ones with power, the youth, the noise, the crowd. They had counted on my politeness, on my reluctance to stir the waters. They never expected me to act, but I had. And now they were leaving, because of a piece of paper, because of me. My grandson looked up briefly. His face was harder to read. There was sadness there, yes, but not the kind that leads to change. It was the sadness of consequence, not understanding. The sadness of a boy who didn't know how far he'd drifted until he washed ashore. I held his gaze for a moment longer than I meant to, and I saw it flicker, guilt, maybe, or just discomfort. But then he looked away. He hoisted the last box into the trunk, shut the door with a heavy thud, and turned the key. And that was it. No apology, no hug, no thank you, not even a wave goodbye. They drove away without looking back. I stood on the porch for a long while after they were gone, my fingers tracing the iron rail that had once been my husband's project. He installed it for me after I slipped on the steps one spring years ago. He said, if this house is your kingdom, you need to walk through it like a queen. I hadn't felt like a queen in a long time, but now maybe I was remembering how to stand tall again. Later that afternoon, I went upstairs with a bucket and a cloth, not because I was angry, but because I needed to reclaim the space with my own two hands. I scrubbed the counters. I opened all the windows. I wiped the mirrors until I could see myself clearly in them, not as someone overlooked, not as someone tolerated, but as someone present. I found a few things they'd left behind: a cheap pair of sunglasses, a notebook with a broken spine, a throw blanket that smelled like expensive detergent and emptiness. I folded it all and put it in a box by the door. If they wanted it, they could come fetch it like any other tenant. I wouldn't be chasing them. That evening, I sat in my chair by the window again, a fresh cup of tea, a slice of pound cake I'd made just for myself. The quiet stretched around me, but this time it wasn't the heavy kind. It was peace, undecorated, uncluttered, and mine. The next morning, the mailbox held a single envelope. No name, no return address, just a small folded card. Inside was a note in his handwriting. I didn't know how much space we were taking. I'm sorry. I really am. No love, no promise, no request to return. Just that. I closed the card slowly and tucked it into the drawer where I kept the birthday one from years ago. I didn't cry. I didn't crumble. Because sometimes regret comes too late to fix anything, but just in time to let you know you were right to walk away. And that was enough. Let them carry their discomfort. Let them wrestle with the echo of what they lost. As, for me, I had my house back, my rhythm, my name. Their faces had said everything. But mine said I'm still here, and I'm not going anywhere. They moved out fast. Too fast, really, like people trying to flee something before it became real. The car came and went in shifts. First the little things, bags of clothing, houseplants, trinkets that meant nothing to me. Then came the furniture. A chair bumped the wall on the way out, and no one apologized. I just stood at the kitchen window watching. I didn't interfere. I didn't offer help. I didn't hover in the doorway. I had done all of that once in the past, offered myself up again and again, in the name of family, in the name of love. But that version of me had quietly packed herself away weeks ago. Now I observed like the homeowner I was, calm, decisive, done. It amazed me how few words were exchanged between us in those final days. We lived within 20 feet of one another, breathing the same air passing in the hallway once or twice, and yet not a single meaningful conversation passed between us. They had nothing to say, or maybe they had too much to say and no courage to say any of it. One afternoon, I came out to find him standing at the bottom of the stairs looking at the rose bush, the one he used to help me prune as a boy. I used to wrap his little hands in my gardening gloves, too big for him, and laugh as he tried to mimic my movements. Now he stood there, with hands in his pockets, head slightly bowed, as if the flowers were about to say something. I didn't call out to him. I didn't ask what he was thinking, because what I had learned, what took me nearly 70 years to fully understand, was that silence isn't always absence. Sometimes it's protection, and mine was no longer his to chip away. He turned, saw me, and gave a small nod. Not a wave, not a smile, just a nod that hovered somewhere between apology and acceptance. I nodded back. Nothing more. That moment was all we would get. She never looked me in the eye again. Not once. She swept through the halls with tight lips and clattering heels, issuing orders and closing doors with pointed finality. I imagined she thought I would feel guilty, or vindictive, or both. But I didn't. I only felt clean, like someone had opened all the windows and finally let the house exhale. One morning I found a dish towel missing, just a silly little thing, white with blue stripes fraying at the corners. It used to sit in the upstairs kitchen, part of a set I had given them when they moved in. I realized they'd taken it with them, perhaps by mistake, perhaps not. And for a brief, irrational moment, I felt something stir, something soft. I sat down and stared at the place where it used to hang. That towel had dried hundreds of plates. It had wiped little messes. It had seen laughter, frustration, maybe even a few tears. And now it was gone too, carried off with everything else. It reminded me that even the smallest pieces of us go when people leave, even the ones we didn't expect to miss. I went upstairs again that evening. The space was empty now. Bare floors, naked shelves, a single bulb swaying gently in the center of the ceiling like a slow pendulum. I stood in the middle of the room and took a deep breath. The air still held the faintest scent of citrus cleaner, and underneath that quiet. No tension, no dread, just quiet. I began gathering what was left behind. A paperclip on the floor, a lone coffee mug with a chip in the rim, a key left on the counter, no note, no thank you. I boxed it up anyway, not for them, for me, to make space, to end it fully. And then I cleaned. I mopped the floors with lavender soap. I opened the windows wide. I played a bit of music softly, something instrumental, gentle, full of breath. As I worked, I hummed along. For the first time in months, I caught myself smiling without realizing it. It wasn't joy, not quite, but it was peace, and peace is worth everything. Later that night, I sat on the porch with a blanket over my knees, a cup of chamomile in hand. The stars above blinked faintly through the bare branches. I looked up and whispered a quiet thank you to no one in particular. Maybe to my husband, who always said, "People show you who they are when they think you won't speak up." He'd been right. I thought of all the conversations I'd never had with them, the truths I had buried out of politeness, the dreams I had folded down to accommodate theirs, and I thought, never again. Some people leave with fire and smoke, others with silence and cardboard boxes, but both leave behind ashes in one way or another. And there I sat in the quiet aftermath, not burned, just finally whole. Let them go. Let them chase a life filled with curated friendships and good lighting and social events where everything fits the vibe. That world had no room for people like me. But this house had always been mine, and it knew me. Every board, every nail, every windowsill. I sipped my tea, slowly breathing in the cool night. The porch was mine again, and so was I. After they left, the house became still in a way I hadn't felt in years, not empty, not sad, just honest. The kind of stillness that lets you hear your own breath again. I walked through each room not because I needed anything, but because I wanted to greet it all. The quiet corners, the worn banisters, the gentle creak of the floorboards that had always known my weight. I whispered to them like old friends, "We're all right now, aren't we?" I thought I'd feel lonely. That's what everyone fears, isn't it? The quiet, the empty rooms, the absence of chatter. But I didn't feel alone. Not the way I had felt when they were upstairs laughing while I cried softly into my tea downstairs. That was a loneliness full of shame. This was different. This was solitude earned and embraced. There was peace in hearing only the wind through the trees, in letting the morning sun stretch fully into both floors of the house without being blocked by someone else's curtains. I opened all the doors. Every room was mine again. I moved my favorite reading chair upstairs by the window that faced the maple tree, the one where birds nested in spring. I hadn't sat by that window in years. I made soup the next day, my husband's favorite, full of garlic and barley and quiet warmth. I let it simmer for hours, the whole house filled with its scent, and for once there was no one to wrinkle their nose and say, "It smells old-fashioned." It smelled like home. I poured myself a bowl and sat in the middle of the upstairs kitchen, the one I'd built with so much care before they moved in. The table was bare, the light a little too harsh, but I didn't mind. I was eating with someone I hadn't dined with in too long myself. I think people forget that we age into silence, not because we like it, but because so many stop listening. But once the noise left, once the careless laughter and dismissive glances were packed up in the back of that car, I found something else underneath the silence. I found my thoughts again. I found the stories I hadn't told in years, the memories I'd tucked away, because no one had time to hear them. I started writing them down in a notebook. Nothing fancy, just little bits of history, old recipes, sayings my grandmother whispered into my ears when I was small. I wrote about the first snow the year my son was born. about the letter my husband sent me from basic training that I still keep in the tin box with his cufflinks. The house had once been a gathering place. Now it was a sanctuary, not filled with visitors, but with presence. My presence, my past, my voice. I lit candles again, the soft beeswax kind, not the over-perfumed ones she liked. Their flames danced gently in the mirrors and made the walls glow like old film. I played my music, Ella Fitzgerald, Nat King Cole, quiet piano in the evenings. I even pulled out the old photo albums and let the memories wrap around me like a quilt. The smiles, the years, all still here, all still mine. One afternoon I found myself humming while doing the laundry. The simple rhythm of folding towels, of smoothing wrinkles, of watching clean fabric stack into order, it brought me comfort. No one sneering, no one scoffing at the way I do things, just the rituals of a life that had earned its quiet. I started going to the garden again. The rosemary bush had survived its bruising. I tied it up gently, whispered apologies to it, and smiled as I saw new growth. The marigolds, too, were pushing through, as if the house wasn't the only one beginning again. Sometimes I wondered if he'd come back, my grandson, not to stay, but to speak, to try. I didn't expect it, but I left a space open in my heart, not because I owed it to him, but because I owed it to myself not to carry bitterness. But if he didn't come, I'd be all right, because I had finally remembered that I am whole, even without the people who once made me feel small. One morning, I woke with the sun. I made pancakes just for fun. I plated them on the blue china I used to save for special days, and as I sat in my kitchen, sunlight stretching across the floor, I realized this day was special because it was mine. And for the first time in too long, I wasn't waiting for anyone to see me. I was looking in the mirror and seeing myself. Not forgotten, not left behind, just free. Weeks passed. The snow melted. The maple in the yard began to bud again. Little green promises poking out through bare branches. The light shifted too, less harsh, more golden. The house, my house, no longer felt like a battleground of unspoken wounds. It felt like it had exhaled with me. It no longer echoed with absence. It rang with presence, with peace. Sometimes I still expected to hear their footsteps overhead, a phantom habit like reaching for a doorknob that's been moved. But then I'd remind myself they were gone, and with them, the ache of not belonging in my own home. What remained was just space, quiet air. I filled it with slow things, with letters I never sent, with flowers from the corner shop, with long baths and soft jazz and the occasional piece of chocolate just because. I even put the wind chime back on the porch. It danced in the afternoon breeze like it had never been taken down. The mailbox stayed mostly empty, flyers, bills, nothing worth reading, but I didn't mind. I had filled my world with other messages now, my own voice on paper, my own laughter as I read back something I wrote 20 years ago, the creak of the garden gate, the ticking of the wall clock at night. It all whispered, "You're here," and that's enough. I saw my neighbor once, Mrs. Ellery, from 2 doors down. She asked how I was managing, if I was safe alone in the house now that the kids had moved out. I smiled at the phrase, moved out, as if it had been a natural, gentle transition. "I'm fine," I said. "Better than fine." And I meant it. There's a peculiar strength that comes when you've chosen yourself after being dismissed. It's not loud. It doesn't roar. It settles into your bones like something earned. And mine was long overdue. I went through old boxes I hadn't touched in years, letters from friends who'd passed on, a scarf my mother crocheted when I turned 16, trinkets from flea markets we used to visit on road trips, I held each item like an artifact not of grief, but of love. All the things I carried into this life. All the people who had seen me before I began to disappear in the eyes of others. And slowly I started inviting small joys back in. I baked pies and gave them to the librarians down the street. I joined a book circle, not to make friends necessarily, but to hear voices other than the ones that used to drown me out. I even painted again just little things, trees, cups of tea, windows with yellow curtains. One day I painted the upstairs suite's kitchen window as it looked now empty, sunlit calm. A room finally breathing. I didn't sign it. I didn't need to. That was for me. People think that reclaiming your life has to be grand, defiant, newsworthy. But the most powerful reclamations are quiet, like slipping into freshly laundered sheets, like placing your favorite mug back on the shelf where it belongs. I didn't hate them, not her, not even him. Hate requires too much space, too much attention, and I had learned how precious my space was, how sacred. If they ever think of me, I hope it's with a flicker of respect, not because I was sweet or generous, but because I remembered who I was before they forgot. And if they don't think of me at all, that's all right too. Because I wake each morning to silence that doesn't sting anymore. I walk through rooms where no one sighs at my presence. I sit at a table where every chair is filled with memory, not disappointment. And I look in the mirror and see someone who didn't raise her voice. She didn't slam doors. She didn't beg. She just remembered her worth, and acted. That is the kind of ending I never knew I could write for myself. And in truth, it's not an ending at all. The house is quiet now. Not the kind of quiet that aches, but the kind that holds you, wraps around you like a soft shawl and says, "You made it." I sit by the window some mornings, hands curled around a warm mug, watching the light fall through the curtains in long ribbons. There's no rush anymore, no pressure to please, no need to perform love just to be allowed in the room. It took a long time to understand this. We don't lose ourselves all at once. We give away little pieces, a silence here, a swallowed word there, 100 small apologies for simply existing, until one day you wake up and realize the echo in your own home is louder than your voice. But I found my voice again, in stillness, in truth, in the sound of paper being signed, the front door shutting the quiet after they left. And in that quiet I heard myself again. Some might say it's sad to live alone, but I don't feel alone. I feel present. I feel anchored. I feel free. The wind chime dances. The tea warms my palms. The floor beneath my feet knows my step, and I breathe easy. Because I didn't need to raise my voice. I didn't need to slam a door. I just needed to remember my worth. Some endings are really just beginnings with the noise turned off, and I gave them silence. In it I found peace,